So we have another very, very interesting panel lined up for everybody. And I'm pleased to announce this panel that dives really deeply into the question of tilting governance towards greater gender parities and identifying better opportunities and outcomes for women. For this panel, we are joined by a really interesting group of experts. And I'd like to first start by inviting Ms. Shrayana Bhattacharya. She is the author of Desperately Seeking Shahrukh and a senior economist at the World Bank Social Protection and Jobs Practice for South Asia. Prior to the World Bank, she worked with the Seva Union, Center for Policy Research, and ILO. Welcome. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Mathangi Krishnamurthy. Please come. Okay. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Mathangi Krishnamurthy. She's an assistant professor of anthropology at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Madras. Dr. Krishnamurthy's areas of interest include the anthropology of work and gender, urban studies, globalization, and her book, 1-800 Worlds, chronicles the labor practices, life worlds, and media atmospheres of India's call centers. So, welcome, Dr. Krishnamurthy. Next, we have Ms. Shalini Sinha, who is a home-based worker, sector specialist, and urban Asia lead for WEIGO, which is a global research policy network that seeks to improve the status of the working poor, especially women, in the informal economy. Her work focuses on issues related to home-based workers of the cities of the global south, and she's engaged with this for over 2 decades. Welcome. Next up, I'd like to invite Mr. Prasanth MP, who is the program manager at the Kudumbashree mission in Kerala. He has around 15 years of experience covering both rural and urban development with a focus on livelihoods and enterprise promotion. Welcome. And last but not least, I'd like to invite my colleague Raghav, who will be moderating this session. Raghav focuses on understanding labor markets in the global south and the socio-economic processes that underlie development. Over to you.
Thank you, Purva. Great. As Sabina noted earlier, we are quite privileged to have a very exciting and a diverse set of panelists today with us. And we have people from multilateral backgrounds, academic, anthropological, and then grassroots work and policy. So we're almost covering all bases here. So, and I extend a warm welcome to all the panelists, and I look forward to this interaction. And the title of the panel discussion is Tilting Governance Towards Greater Gender Parity, Better Opportunities and Outcomes for Women. Now, the way we have structured this panel discussion is in the following way. I will make a few remarks to set the overall context for the discussion. And then we will have a round of speaker-specific questions. And then we will have, we'll take in questions from the audience, as opposed to taking audience questions towards the end. We will take, so I would like to alert the audience that we would be having a round of questions from you after an initial round of discussion here. So please keep your questions ready. And then time permitting, we will take a few more questions towards the end. And so I wanted to frame this discussion by highlighting India's experience of economic development. I mean, strangely, India is amongst other lower middle income countries. India's trajectory has been similar yet very distinct. For example, barring the experience of Vietnam, many of the other LMIC countries in Africa and Asia have had like this experience of incomplete transition from being an agrarian society to a modern industrialized society. And workers majorly continue to be in agriculture or service sectors, and there is this huge absence of a large industrial workforce. But from a gender perspective, India is very distinct. Among all the lower middle income countries, India's labor force participation for women continues to be very low, even despite the recent reversal in trend. And even the gap between the female labor force participation and the corresponding number for men is also the highest for India, and then it's followed by Bangladesh and then followed by other countries. But India continues to be an outlier here. And as Sabina also noted earlier, that women continue to be employed majorly in agricultural sector in India, and the share of self-employed workers among women is also increasing. And this somehow points to women's employment being majorly concentrated in precarious and vulnerable forms of employment. Now, this certainly suggests that there is a lot more to be done to improve representation, to improve parity, to improve gender wage gaps, and on many other important employment outcomes. And given this broad framing, I would like to put my first question to Shrayana. We do have this, to be honest, abysmally low levels of labor force participation for women. And at the same time, we also have, women have higher educations more than ever. And then we also have the economy growing at very high rates. And given this paradox, how do you explain this paradox? And could you speak to the aspirations of women and girls and the ability of our society and our economy, to be more specific, their ability to respond to some of these aspirations and address them?
Yeah, thanks so much. That's a whole set of, I think it's almost individual pieces. And good afternoon, everyone. I apologize that you couldn't get coffee, tea, but I hope you can quickly run out and get some as we're in the middle of even speaking. I want to start, actually, Raghav, before I reflect a bit on what's happening to the numbers, I want to sort of say, I'll start with maybe my author hat, and then I know you have a set of questions on technical fixes, and that's maybe when I'll wear the institutional hat of being at the World Bank. And what I want to start by saying is, so much of this question of what has happened to women in the economy and how we frame questions around structural transformation. And I think this goes to the question I was asking the previous panel, is who has told that story? And what I mean by that is today we're in this panel and in this room with 3 women, 2 men. For my next book, which is called The Tyranny of the Indian Uncle, I'm sort of getting into how middle-aged men of certain caste groups have essentially just dominated. We call it market capture, right? It's market capture of voice. I did a simple list. I did something very simple in 2023. I took a set of agenda items of all the big policy conferences that have happened, particularly on the economy, and I just measured how many women were speaking. One of the biggest conferences, which will not be named, but I think many of us will guess which one I'm talking about, had 22 male speakers and 9 women speakers, right? They had manels upon manels. Yesterday, I was at a book launch on the big macroeconomic shifts in India. It was a manel, a man in conversation with 2 men. Funnily enough, the book was, actually I won't name the book as well, but again, people will understand exactly what I'm talking about, which is it was about shifting away from the traditional way of thinking about the economy. How are we going to shift away from the traditional way of thinking about the economy if we're not going to make voices more diverse and platform very different perspectives? And I think first I want to congratulate the center, because I think to me the fundamental shift that needs to happen, the question that was raised earlier, the people who are collecting the data, only barely a third, you can fill out positions for women. And I think it's high time, not just women, but women from historically marginalized groups should be actually telling the story. So it shouldn't really be me. And in fact, I was joking with Sabina earlier, this is one of the last panels I'm doing. In fact, I've started saying no, because I don't think it is my place to sit and constantly opine on the economy. I think it's high time other voices did so. And so to me, what is absolutely central is, it's not just about the numbers, but who is constructing the numbers, who's designing the numbers, who is getting to tell the story around those numbers. So I think to me, voice is critical. And I think the more we can first have women in positions of storytelling on the economy, in creating the data on the economy, without that, you're not going to shift the needle when it comes to this. 9 and 22 is just not going to cut it. And I refuse to believe, people keep telling me it's a pipeline effect, it's because there are not enough women out there. I don't believe that. If you just look at academic departments, there are enough women in economics, there are enough women who you could rely on. Having a manel on the economy should be outlawed. And we should all, I think we should really think very credibly about what kind of, yeah, I mean, I feel very strongly about this, but, you know, we really, I mean, I don't want to hear the same upper caste man who's again usually Bengali or Malayali telling me about, and you're laughing because you know what I'm talking about, but you've had to really suffer it the other way, which is I think the voices have to shift. And I promise this will be one of the last. Maybe I'll do this panel, and in 2024 I'll do one more. If Sabina invites me after all the things I say right now and provoke problems. So that's one, right? And I think that's very important. Why is that also important? For example, if you look at the numbers right now, you'll see that for upper caste women like myself, who come from caste privileges, who have salaried jobs, we are earning, I mean, essentially far more than even scheduled caste, scheduled tribe women. So to me, for example, the gender gap right now of the wage gap is SC/ST women earn about 54% of the wages that upper caste women do in salaried jobs. So to me, it's not just a male-female gap. There are all these social cleavages through which this process of growth needs to be viewed, right? And if you look at specifically the question of women's employment, I mean, there's a lot that's been said about sort of all kinds of technical reasons. One of the things that I would really like to highlight is that what's happened with economic growth in India, and I've documented this in my book, and for those who are curious about what Shah Rukh Khan has to do with the economy, please just read the book. This is, you know, you'll figure it out. It's pretty clear in the book. What you do realize is that while growth may not have led to income redistribution, growth has certainly led to the redistribution of aspirations and dreams. And what I mean by that is I have followed for 15 years the lives of women who are home-based workers. Shalini was part of some of the preliminary research that set up the book. I have followed women who are domestic workers, home-based workers, accountants in the Indian accounting service, you know, the first women in their generation, in their families to actually have a job, speak English. And what you realize in all these women, be it rural UP, forests of Jharkhand, coastal areas in Kerala, go to the cities of, you know, small towns in UP, aspirations to actually live a particular kind of life and to be economically independent have just expanded. And what's happened then is the jobs don't exist. And I think there is a very serious crisis. I think to the point that was being made in the previous conversation, there aren't enough jobs right now. And there has to be a very clear conversation about where will those jobs come from? Is it going to be service-led? If it's going to be service-led, what kind of service-led growth is that going to be? And I think in that conversation, again, I'll link it to that previous point, what is the role of women? Because I think what's happened now is that we tend to say, well, we'll grow, we'll have those jobs, and then somehow those jobs will just percolate to women. We grew for a very long period of time. The data tells us, there's a wonderful ILO estimate which says 19% of jobs in the 11 fastest growing sectors in the country, only 19% have gone to women. So even if we've had this massive period of growth up till a point of time, the jobs have not accrued to women. And I often say India is liberalized for men. If you look at just the way the economy has worked, women are still waiting for that promise of liberalization. And what we have received in liberalization, some of us, people like me, I think for us it's been a huge boom, right? That 54% gap that I was telling you about. But if you look at women that Shalini works with through WEIGO or various other women involved in casual work, casual labor, self-employment, the employment is precarious. And I think, to me, the real question is, where will those aspirations be voiced? What are the economic decision-making institutions, right? What will be the role of these women in that kind of decision-making process? And since we're talking about governance, I want to really stress that, which is that right now, you know, if you look at even, forget parliament, you look at, you know, finance secretaries across states or labor secretaries across states, they're still fairly male-dominated positions, right? And to me, I'm not I know that, you know, this question about affirmative action is sort of, you know, people have very strong views about it, one way or the other. But I do think it's high time we started thinking about affirmative action for women from certain communities, not all women, when it comes to some of these very critical decision-making roles. If you don't have that, you're not going to change the narrative. Because, you know, I think, you know, what the speaker earlier said, that, well, we've been waiting for these women to come and fill up roles in the survey agencies. well, if you created a mandate, and we know this in the government, if you create a mandate, it will happen. And I always believe economics 101 is incentive alignment. If it's not happening, it's because there are incentives in the system that don't want it to happen. And I think to me, I think, Raghav, I'll just close with this, which is this question about if aspirations have really expanded and yet income redistribution has not happened, the redistribution of job opportunities has not happened, those aspirations need to find political voice. And I think the political voice of women when it comes to economic governance systems, that's where we're just woefully lacking. So I think that's where I would like to sort of push the debate. And no manuals, please, on economics.
Yeah, just a quick notice. Tea is served outside, so people who want to bring their tea or coffee inside, they could do so. Yeah, but continuing, yeah, thank you, Shrayana, for bringing issues of representation and the shifts in aspirations. And in some ways, they are quite related to each other as well. And the shifts in aspirations, I mean, calls for greater representation, if not more. So I think that's quite an important point. And I want to I have a small follow-up, but I'll probably come to that later. But I want to shift to Mathangi. Mathangi, you've been an anthropologist who has looked at issues of women's work in the BPO, women's bodies, medical care, etc. So on one hand, you have this increasing tendency of globalization. On the other, there is the patriarchal tendencies of the society. And I want to first ask you, could you share some of the insights from your work about the shifts that you are observing? And I also want to ask a methodological question to you, and it is this: what are some of the specific advantages of employing the ethnographic method? And Shrayana has also used it in her work of to discern some of these patterns that you're witnessing.
Thank you, Raghav, for that question. Good afternoon to everyone. Clearly, you're still here, don't need your caffeination yet, so that bodes well for this panel. The advantage of having been here all morning long is that I've been thinking about this panel, these questions, even as the other speakers were talking very specifically about governance and policy. So I will start off perhaps speaking a little bit about the question that Dr. Sen posed to me, which is, why are these anthropologists and sociologists not talking about policy? Why do they not help us do these statistics better? And my answer was, he is right. But the reasons why he is right is because more often than not, the question that is asked to social scientists is, tell us how to fix this. The categories that they arrive with to social scientists assume that gender is a commonsensical construct, more often than not translating to gender equals woman. All women, barring a few paradigm shifts here and there, a few intersectional categories, can therefore be addressed in one of two ways. And I'm reducing, I'm sort of passing the conversations all day long. There are two possibilities. One is, of course, inherited from the developmentalist state, women as a subject of intervention and welfare. And two is women as the neoliberal subject, the one that has recently come to aspirations, is capable, therefore, in the infamous words of Sheryl Sandberg, of leaning in, never mind questions of cultural capital or what Shrayana already referred to as caste, as class, as coming in with inherent benefits. So social scientists will begin by giving you the really long, tedious, and unpleasant answer that women is not a singular category. And this is unpalatable, very often, for governance that comes in with small timelines and smaller budgets. And therefore, how do we bridge this conversation? And in relation to what you very specifically asked me, Raghav, I started working, my book is called 1-800-Worlds, and I looked at call center culture. And much like good neoliberal subjects, I was not interested in women. I said, well, this is a corporate setup, one should not go there and ask, how are the women dealing with it? And as an aside, I have a friend and colleague, Reena Patel, who wrote a fantastic book called Working the Night Shift on women call center workers. What I realized when working with young people between the ages of 18 and 25, which sort of worked for me at that point of time, was the women did not want to be referred to as women call center workers. So the fact of gender, or the fact of gendering of work, comes about by listening to them, not by asking, as women, how do you feel? Because as we well know it, with the kind of inherent disadvantages that come with putting gender front and center in this profoundly patriarchal landscape, you're either seen as a subject of welfare or one who has to overcome gender. There are these two positions that you're asked to occupy. So the Center for Gender Analysis, therefore, provides this wonderful opportunity to really ask, where is gender located and what is gender? So in the ethnographic method, as a card-carrying sociocultural anthropologist, how gender works for me is not what gender is, but what gender does. I see gender as a floating signifier. You have to locate it before you're able to ask, how is it that governance can bring about gender parity, gender justice, all of these things that we've been talking about in this room all morning, as if you and I agree on what it means. And I'd like to state that every time the site changes, the question changes. It's very, very difficult to do short-term work, to provide short-term solutions on the basis of ongoing long-term ethnographic work. Having said that, let me seg into why ethnographic work is essential in my understanding, and this is not merely a plea for my job, but as a way of saying what is the founding principle of ethnographic work, or the founding principle indeed of all social sciences. The idea is, how do you understand somebody else's experience? What is the best that you can do to understand the location, constraints, aspirations, desires, all of these words that we use together, to know what it is that will make a difference to their lives? Where you have to go back to square one and say, what is the closest I can do that? I can do it in the most radically philosophical fashion possible by becoming them. So Dr. Sen was talking about time use surveys, and in passing he mentioned that problem with time use surveys is the woman may not have a conception of time. My response would be, in which case statistics needs to change their definition of time. Not that women must be told how to account for life in terms of time as we understand it as a standardized measure. When he said, well, you know, it depends on housework, how they're performing it, housework is a tremendously gendered concept. The time that it takes me to cook lunch varies very differently than my male-identified partner, who takes 3 times as long. Because in our education system, cooking, managing house are not considered male bastions. How do you account for time use in those ways? Work itself is inherently gendered in terms of space and time. The moment it leaves the house, it gains more value. The moment it's performed by a man, it gains more value. Performance by the man in the house is valued differently than woman in the house. So even this question of time wastage will be answered differently depending on the body that's answering it. Ethnography can get to this. If ethnographic work allows you long-term capacity to walk in the shoes of another person, and it's true, I completely attest to the fact that field workers also need to have the capacity to be diverse, not merely as a job, which is the only way they can get to questions. The first anthropologists that worked on women and women's issues happened to be anthropologists' wives. And they wrote small little non-fiction books that were not even considered serious accounts. They were sort of along for the ride, and they said, well, I'm hanging out here. We have a year and a half in a remote location. Let me ask the women how they're doing. The first anthropological accounts do not take into account the lives of women as valid lives. So the question of validity itself, we have to start ground up in order to be able to break down governance as not an issue of intervention, but as an issue of understanding first. And Secretary Ahuja spoke about this morning. She said, well, you know, we're moving to the gig economy, we're moving to the service economy. Most of the time, and I'm an anthropologist of work, I ask the question, why do women want to work? Why does anybody want to work? And the answer to that changes depending on the body that is asking it and the body that is answering it. And these are tremendously subjective concerns that disturb the idea of result-based intervention or outcome-based intervention. Those disturbances are the problem that governance will not accommodate. And therefore, we do not have a bridge between the social sciences and policy very, very often because the questions need to be changed. In my own work, when I started looking at call center workers, I realized that among young men and women, the motivations were very, very different. And often they would come at you from left field, and they varied depending on the intersectional position of the women involved. For married women, it was an opportunity to get away from the household. He said, we do not have value unless we are able to leave the house. For younger women, often from Mufassal locations, smaller towns, they were part of intercaste marriages, interclass marriages, and needed an avenue, A, to run away, and B, to support themselves. One of the responses that I got, which I spoke about, when a young woman, I asked her, why are you at the call center? This is not necessarily the best work. Do you enjoy it? She said, no, but I'll tell you the answer. My story is like the film Satya. Exactly that. The response had nothing to do with work and everything to do with life conditions. So the moment we start looking at women as full subjects, and not woman qua woman, right? And a lot of people have referred to this. This has been the case. Do we consider women as exceptional subjects, nurturing, caring, wonderful, resilient, or do we consider that as the condition through which a woman is produced? What about the capacity of women to be bad subjects? What about the capacity of women to be avaricious, to be lazy, to not be exemplary? Does that count for a valid subject position in a society in which the questions are about productivity, are about independence? How do these words matter to the women themselves? It's something that ethnographic research is able to do. My other work, which only comes at this tangentially, is to do with intersex bodies, which disturbs the very idea of gender itself, and that takes it to a different realm.
Yeah, thank you, Mathangi. One key takeaway for me is that, I mean, just as Marxists speak about the class process, I mean, it's important to see gender also as process. And at our, at the Center for Gender Analysis, through our work on like frameworks and tools, I mean, we're trying to move away from viewing gender as just, I mean, not just as a dependent variable or a control variable, but move much beyond that to see how we can understand gender in much more holistic ways. So thank you for that. Next, let's shift to Shalini. And I want to bring the issue of informality into this discussion. And it is something that's become a very defining characteristic of countries in Asia and Africa. And it would be great if you could speak about some of the challenges that informal women workers face, and in what ways are they visible or invisible to people in the policy-making spaces, planners, and so on. Yeah.
So, informality actually defines a lot of work in many of the developing countries, not just for women, but also for men, more so for women than for men. But informality is also, informal work is also segmented. So women are concentrated in particular jobs, usually at the bottom of the pyramid, which are very precarious and low paying. Yeah? And when you're talking about invisibility, it is another lens to look at this work is to look at it from the place of work. So a large number of women workers in India are in home-based work or in domestic work, in urban. I'm only talking about urban because I work in urban situations. Now, if they are in these, home is a place of work, then the invisibility actually stems also from the place of work. Because when we think of place of work, we think of an office, we think of a shop, we think of some very formal places of work. Because the whole work that we have, our own thinking and analysis of labor market and the laws and policy that govern it is very determined by the formal sector, which is ironic because the formal sector is so small and the informal sector is so large. So So the first thing about invisibility is that informality happens in informal spaces of work. Now, for women, it might happen in homes, in their own homes as home-based workers, in others' homes as domestic workers. But it also happens on the streets as street vendors. And when women, and even there is a differentiation. So studies have shown that when street vendors are both men and women, women would be selling goods that are perishable and in setting in places where the risks or harassments are high. So the costs and risks, when you put the lens of costs and risks of doing business, even in sectors where men dominate, it is higher for women. And that is invisible. People are not seeing that. So work, informal work, in any case, does not have social security, has very limited protection, and on top of that, to be at the bottom of the pyramid and invisible. So, and why is it bad to be invisible? How does it manifest itself, this invisibility? It manifests itself in so many different ways. It manifests itself in measurement, in statistics, how your work is measured, often written off. Home-based work where I work is often written off as part-time work, as something that they do because they have some spare time. Hobby hai, craft work hobby hai, leisure hai. And if you look at it, then they're working long hours under very precarious conditions. So first is numbers. We don't have good numbers, and we've discussed a lot about it, why we don't have it, what is the issue. But it does create an invisibility and a lack of understanding of where the women are, where are they concentrated and what they're doing. The second is, not understanding the risks of what they're doing. For instance, let me give you a very recent example of, recovery from COVID. We've been studying recovery from COVID across sectors, and we see that home-based workers, the recovery from COVID is the least, and very, very less than the street vendors. But confronted with it are other crises that are happening, which is, cost of living crisis, now climate crisis. This is cyclic nature of crisis is borne by the women, it is completely invisible because of the nature of work that they do and also because of their care responsibilities. It's in a woman's life, there is no compartmentalization of economic work and care responsibility. And for home-based workers, there is no compartmentalization of workspace, study room, study or office and homes. They work where they cook or eat, and so that is the third aspect of invisibility that I wanted to show. In urban spaces, women's work is invisible, particularly when it is from home, in urban plans and in city planning. You plan a city which does not facilitate or in fact hinders women's work. So you have to think of planning a city. There is, of course, this whole notion of planning a city which does not look at informal work and workspaces and protect and promote them. But there is also this whole issue of that the invisibility of women's work, then they are not included in whether there's housing or whether there's zoning or whether there's transport, etc. So that's the third level of invisibility that I wanted to talk about. And the fourth level of invisibility is what Shrayana alluded to, is that, a seat at the table. I think that is very important, that if you're wanting to actually be an inclusive society, then women, their own organizations and their own voice and not somebody speaking for them, whether it is a union, whether it is any other organization or whether it is a husband. It is women's own voice has to be included in the governance process and institutionalized, not on an ad hoc basis. It has to be institutionalized and made statutory. In a crisis, women are often consulted sometimes. But how do we make a governance system which spans employment and urban development and social policy so that women are included in the very process of design and implementation of these policies?
Thank you, Shalini. Thank you for making us see some of these invisibilities that mark informal women workers' lives. A program that has been making women and women's work more visible is the Kudumbashree program and Kudumbashree program in Kerala. And this program has managed to shape social and economic outcomes for the better in Kerala for a good period of time over the years. And with Kudumbashree, as some of these initiatives are being piloted in other states as well, could you share with us some of the insights that you have gleaned over the many years that you have worked in Kudumbashree? What are the learnings? What are the things that have worked for Kudumbashree? And what are the lessons that must be kept in mind while these interventions are being piloted in other states as well?
Hello everyone. Thank you, Raghav, and I thank Sabina and JustJobs Network for inviting me to share Kudumbashree's experience here. And I also congratulate for the Center for Gender Analysis initiative. That's something that we are also looking forward for with a lot of academic writings as well as discourses around and discussions in the government space. I'm here to share about Kudumbashree's. Kudumbashree, for example, for people who are not familiar, is the government of Kerala's initiative started 25 years back for ensuring better participatory governance at the decentralization process. Government of Kerala also, or Kerala has done various reformative measures over the years. One being it also forefront in the decentralization process. So that's the major background against which Kudumbashree's Women Empowerment Initiative was also placed by the government. It's a completely government-funded program, unlike various other programs that we can see in different states of the country. And the ownership from the political leadership as well as giving a stable leadership at the mission that has actually helped to focus on clear issues. Kudumbashree's model is co-terminus at the community level with the Panchayati Raj system or the municipal administration system, where the smallest tier, which is the women's self-help groups called as neighborhood groups in Kerala, and a ward level federation equivalent co-terminus with the ward member, elected ward member, and at the Panchayati level, there is the community development society, which is co-terminus with the Panchayat governance system. So the participatory decision-making process starts from the planning stage at the grassroots level, where demands from the community represented representatives of the poor is taken by the community and are put forth in the planning process at the governance level. Apart from being actively part of the governance, Kudumbashree's three mottos, which largely focuses on through women, the family and the society's development, and women empowerment as the underlying principle through which the social and economic empowerment of the family is taken care. That has been the driving motto of Kudumbashree. And one major focus from the beginning of the Kudumbashree movement of Kerala was, it was never an activity to create or pool in money or credit. It was an initiative to make people come together, discuss their issues and challenges, come together for addressing the issues in the society. And there is clear difference between credit, access to credit, and focus on an income. Because the thrift or the savings activity or the formal connections with the banks give you money. But then that doesn't always convert into income. So Kudumbashree somehow from the very beginning have been focusing on multiple sorts of income generation initiatives for the community, and hence business also promoting rural, micro enterprises from the community was a major focus. When enterprises idea started, also the focus on providing the adequate hand-holding to the entrepreneurs, specifically from the SHG members and their family, that was also part. taking the many of these initiatives of Kudumbashree has been model for India. From those two models, one working very closely with the Panchayati Raj institutions and the federations of the women, that was treated as one of the best model, and another was providing support system to the community in promoting enterprises as the second model. As of today, the Kudumbashree's National Resource Organization platform under the National Rural Livelihood Mission have been able to pilot and disseminate the experiences through practitioners of Kerala with the women from the community from Kerala and outside other states where we have trained. Those women largely have been disseminating their lived experiences in grooming the community and the resources there. The diversity of the country where we have worked has been fascinating, and it also showed lot of strength in the community level. Women with lot of skills, whether it is craft or handloom or the various cuisines or products they can make, they are fascinating. Some of the states in the Northeast, for example, will also show you fascinating entrepreneurial journey of women. They drive the entrepreneurial journey there. But when we tried out many of these learnings outside Kerala, it has been a mix of things, because creating local governance easy for the community, there are challenges where Panchayati Raj institutions, architectures, functions at different levels in different states. So hence, whatever be the limitations in the structure, it is always important that community have access and close proximity with the local governance. That has been one of our major learnings. From the entrepreneurial journey side, not all or the poorest of the poor can probably focus on enterprises, but the moment you provide the hand-holding mechanism, create that facilitatory atmosphere, yes, we have seen that the program, Startup Village Entrepreneurship Program, even though it doesn't name it as a women-centric program, it is implemented through the Rural Livelihood Mission. So far has promoted over the 7 years close to 2.5 lakhs of women entrepreneurs, out of which I would say around 60% are women-owned and women-managed enterprises. A huge shift from the kind of data that showed before these kind of programs. Lot more are to be done. The support architecture that we talk as ecosystem, that is critical for rural entrepreneurs, especially women from the community, if they are encouraged to start enterprises with all the factors that we have discussed from other panels and earlier sessions. So the knowledge ecosystem, the finance, access to finance, and the affordability of the finance as a finance ecosystem, and incubation. These are three major ecosystems that we have been talking about that entrepreneurs, irrespective of gender, would require. Especially placed at the community level, the community federations, their resilience and their understanding, their empowerment matters a lot in facilitating other fellow members from the community to initiate entrepreneurial journey. It would obviously create more employment in the future, but we have also seen that the catalyst in the entire process have been the fellow community members. We have used the larger NRLM focus of identifying youth from the community, specifically more from the women, grooming them with the right information and hand-holding through other fellow members from other parts of the country. That model has really worked remarkable progress. Their understanding, we have worked with, especially in rural areas, the education level that we have come across is below 5th standard education has been predominantly the largest one, with varying to up to the 10th or +2 education. But then while you engage with them over a period of 3 to 4 years through a sustainable process, a systematic approach, we have seen remarkable changes in the community, and that has something that should be probably I would look forward to Center for Gender Analysis also to look at some of these areas as an area of study and research also, so that these smaller initiatives has scope of expanding and creating better impact in the society. Yeah, I would probably stop at there.
Thank you, Prasanth, for identifying these areas of critical intervention for us. Thank you also for alerting us to the need to keep in mind the institutional specificity while we scale up some of these interventions to other places. So can we take some questions from the audience? So yeah, we invite questions from the audience. I would prefer that students get the first chance here. So any student who wants to begin by asking question, and please identify yourself. Yeah. If you're intending the question to a specific panelist, please mention that as well.
Hi everyone. I'm Manmeet, the British Asian Trust, and thank you for this panel. I think my question will veer towards that side of the panel, just how we imagine women's lives, the possibilities of Bollywood and Shah Rukh Khan, and thinking about the flavor of everyday lives of women. And I'll start with a quick story, I'll make it short. I was having a conversation with someone very close to me about this new productivity mantra of deep work and 2 hours of uninterrupted work and Pomodoro techniques and whatnot. And then we exited where we were, and he called up someone who he employs during the day at night saying, parking wala gate khol do minute aake. And I was like, but you're interrupting his leisure time. You're interrupting whatever deep work he might be engaged in right now. Just because you can't imagine what deep work he might be doing after his work hours, whatever it might be. And my question is, how do we, considering the divergences, the varieties in people's lives in India, especially in a country like India, and the previous panel said that beyond the state level, the irreverence toward data almost, and what you said about the micro data available in people's lives. How do you do scale policy in such a diverse country where we can't even imagine that similar mental models could apply to the population? How do you even begin thinking about policy here?
That's a really excellent question. In fact, it's funny, I just wrote down, there was a bunch of notes and it'll correspond. So a couple of things. I think Dr. Sen actually gave us a little bit of a mantra on this, which is we are, and yes, you know, so much of what is happening in society, and I always, you know, it's important to remember the economy, which tends to be what this sort of the space of policy that at least I'll speak to, and particularly around questions of transformation and employment. The economy is a subset of society. It's a set of very complex processes, and I think she really eloquently pulled that out. But it is also important to realize a lot of decisions impact categories. And he mentioned that it's important to think, especially when we look at deep inequalities, which are almost jumping out at you when you look at these categories, men and women, based on caste, based on class, based on income, right? They're very obvious, and you can see them in the way the data is speaking to you, in the way our lives are speaking to us, this anecdote that you just mentioned. I think there are a couple of things that are required. One is, I think we have to be very careful about the fact that the decision-making point, unfortunately what happens right now is that, for example, if I say we want to make a certain decision using a certain data set, that data set is sort of either state level, maximum it will be district level, decentralized decision-making using data, which will acknowledge that kind of diversity currently doesn't exist. And that is a whole decentralization debate, which is very, very critical, right? So I think data is fundamental to many of those decisions, but it's a question of at what level of aggregation are you actually applying that to, and what level of aggregation are you speaking to as well in terms of a governance unit. So that's one. I think the second thing that's really important is I think it's very important to realize what is the point of how, you know, when you say using information to sort of think about policy in a country with so much heterogeneity, I think the question I always ask is, who is your audience? I think the challenge I face, and I face this as someone, I'm a failed academic. I thought I was going to do a PhD, and then I thought, this is really not for me. And I sort of thought, well, maybe eventually I'll end up in the world of civil society, and right now I'm sort of in this sort of, you know, very institutional role in the middle. And the reason I'm saying this is because I think the problem is academics at the end of the day are incentivized to write for academia. And this is true for economists, this is true for, so there's a paper, there's a theory, there's the way it will be written. And in policy making, it's really complicated because often a lot of economists are essentially producing information for very powerful people. It is not information for a public conversation. And if you look at the big shifts that have happened, universalization of the public distribution system, the creation of Manrega, what Asar has done to learning quality outcomes and assessments, what Seva has done with all the work on the Unorganized Social Security Act, that was never data collected just for one powerful person or a set of bureaucrats or technocrats, right? It was a wider conversation involving very dynamic voices, many of whom disagreed with each other as well, right? To create a public movement. And I think it's absolutely critical when you think of sort of not questions of, well, what will the minimum wage be pegged at in a particular district? When you're thinking of large policy conversations such as, should women's work be monetized, care work be monetized? Just thinking about that, right? Or should there be affirmative action for women from certain communities in all our economic decision-making systems? That requires data as a public conversation. Where I get frustrated, and honestly the reason I wrote, for example, Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh, is I was frustrated with this conversation on women's labor force participation that's completely inward. I mean, it's only being discussed at policy conferences amongst the same 30 people who've known what's happening for a very long period of time. I think you have to have a conversation which is much more public, involving people across languages, across classes, who can participate in that conversation. And we have to be very honest, data is intimidating. And we have created a society where for women, data is much more intimidating than most. And I think this is where, I talk about this, Shah Rukh Khan in a way sort of tricked people into reading more about what's happening to women in the economy and helped me out. I'm very grateful. And if there can be popular culture that can be leveraged, right? Be it, think about what's happening in sort of Tamil pop right now around conversations on caste, right? Think about using information but sharing it in much more creative ways to create movements, to create public conversations. I think that is actually the way you're going to get perhaps not consensus, but a conversation which can then maybe result in a few more acceptable outcomes. Right now, what's happening is we tend to reduce, for example, the women's employment issue is something I know very well. We reduce it to this deeply technicalese, academies conversation, alienating actually the people about whom this conversation is supposed to be about, and sort of saying, well, we'll make the decision for you, right? Where we can't even be bothered to get enough survey investigators that are women. I mean, let's start with that. And I think to me, the real issue there is how do we use data to spark a public, spirited conversation? And there are examples of this. I just mentioned Seva, Asar are institutional examples of this. There are movements that have used data within the whole complexity of these broad categories, simplifying and reducing. I have a line in my book. I basically say, like, statisticians are the bravest people on the planet. You're collapsing so much complexity. It's like epistemic bravery of the highest level, right? You just collapsed everything into one little node. I think, you said that so beautifully. But I think to me, that's the critical piece. And the last thing, I'll just close with this, I realize I've said a lot, is to do that, who will fund these things? Because right now, if you look at funding for research, it's research institutions, academia, donors. I think I also understand that donors think about it certain way. I work currently for an organization that also does contract out research, and I see that action research still remains heavily, chronically underfunded. And I think if there is going to be this question about using data for a public conversation, I think it's now, that's where we can have a technical conversation amongst donors, development groups, development partners. How do we support that better in more efficient ways? My career started with action research projects. Maybe I'm just very partial to them, but I think that is going to be fundamental. We can't be relying on the academics doing their thing for academia and then partially being involved in studies. And, sort of that model is not working, or it's going to produce, cute RCTs where, like, you put CCTVs in rooms and it's wonderful, but so what? And I think to me, that's really where the conversation needs to be. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, just to carry on where Shrayana left off, is, in just 2-3 small stories. So we did this whole study on COVID across 11 cities of the world, etc., and we asked the workers to set out their demands. One of the key demands was nothing for us without us. So involvement of people, the so-called beneficiary in actual design, is a very important aspect. I'm just coming in the morning from a climate change workshop. That climate change workshop had 2 aspects to it. It had 4 sectors of workers coming and talking about climate change. They did not use the word climate change, but they talked really about impact of climate change. And there was a set of experts who talked about climate change using the word and numbers so much, but it did not make sense of what was happening on the ground. So, it's this gap that needs to be filled. It's this information, this knowledge, grassroots knowledge, which needs to be filtered up, and information and data that is being collected needs to be filtered down to have a conversation where there is a participatory process. Then only I think this contextual issues will be addressed. And the second example I wanted to give was also how data, research, and technocratic issues then become a tool of exclusion. So Delhi is in the process, in fact, final stages of writing the master plan. And for years, the master plan has been a technical instrument of planning, which has not included the grassroots groups, or has included them very nominally. But once we were able to set up a coalition of activists, academics, and workers, this conversation was facilitated by all. And it changed the nature of the campaign, but it also changed us. We started quoting numbers as activists, and the academics started making activist demands. So it is a process, enriching process, but needs to be done in a very institutionalized way. It does not happen by itself. It needs to be facilitated.
I'll add a few more data. The NREGA, MGNREGA program in Kerala is largely participatory and by women. There were aspects discussed in the morning, whether it is less incentivizing to the men or not, but the entire process of planning and executing, everything is led by the community. Second, as I mentioned in the PRI, Panchayat Raj institution process, the local decision making and planning process, that also is largely dominated by women as of today. So that has actually seen higher participation, and the political leadership, if we look at that, out of the 50% representation in the Panchayati Raj system, 33% of those leadership came from the community representatives. So the kind of exposure they get from the system, the kind of space and empowerment process they undergo throughout the process, I think that has been remarkable in the entire exercise as an added point. Yeah.
I'm just sort of going to shamelessly riff off everybody. I think the panel pretty much, represents the work collectively of how things have to happen ground up. And, feminist standpoint theory will tell you it's the most marginalized that have the most valuable understanding of how society works. So policy has to necessarily be from that point of view. The second thing I will add to it is there is an urgent demand to expand the conceptual repertoire of policymakers and of decision makers. How things are defined need to be radically re-educated. And to that extent, I think everybody's testifying to the fact when Shalini said that people are talking about climate change, who you think about as the experts are using language that needs to find its way to the academics and the policymakers. And lastly, in terms of what Shrayana also brought about, just popular culture figuration, looking at the demise of things that are discussed in the popular culture space, or even allowed to be discussed, if I might say so. And I have a small story about this from my employer, IIT Madras, where I turned up a year after being employed there, knocked on my neighbor's door and said, "Hi, I've just moved in to this place." And she said, and I'll say it in Tamil and translate it, She said, "Sir in the department." I said, "Kaun se which department does sir belong to?" Right? And what this speaks to is that the figure of an IIT Madras faculty member is male. It does not matter, and I'm talking about after 40 years of the establishment of IIT Madras, in a profession that I have access to thanks to caste and class capital. And if this is the situation here, we are talking about a radical need for reconfiguring what the stereotypical figures in each space look, sound, right, seem like. And that must come about through conversation that breaks down these silos. What are the appropriate discussion points for popular culture? What's appropriate to academia? What's appropriate to policy? Without the conversational spaces for this, this is a lost proposition, because ultimately I maintain that the economy is a profoundly cultural concept.
I want to add something to this, which is, this has happened to me so many times. I walk into rooms to meet bureaucrats and then say, World Bank sir kahan hai? So I think just turning to the point that this is, and I understood what you said in Tamil because I heard one version of it. And I think I just want to reiterate that I just feel that particularly, yes, gender is a process, there are all these there's so much complexity. But I think the first thing to do right now is to acknowledge all the work of people like Naila Kabir, Ashwini Deshpande, the anthropologists, economists. Women holding independent incomes will change our societies. We have to think very carefully about how that works in a safe, careful way and have a public conversation about it. I mean, I realize it's very prescriptive, but it is, it's something that's staring us in the face, and we are still in the bottom 5 of the world when it comes to women in the economy. I think that if that doesn't shift, I don't think our social mores will shift either.
But Shrayana, it's not just jobs, it's just jobs.
Just jobs, yes, absolutely.
Thank you for that plug. Any other questions? Yes. Please identify yourself too.
Well, I'm Tej Panjay. I'm from the press. I'm a journalist. I have two questions, please. One is for you are a member of Parliament, no? Mr. Prasanth MP. This is in context of the Kerala Dinesh BD. It was a pioneer in the cooperative movement in the industrial sector. What is the fate today? Have you been able to translate and incorporate it in your programs? And the second one is about, madam, you mentioned about the term that too much of male domination is there. So should we do away with the term manpower? Do you have any other...
Hi, sir. I am not a member of Parliament. That's just my initial. I represent Kudumbashree here. It's a different community organization concept I'm here for. The Dinesh BD concept, I'll not elaborate, but I think they have diversified into different areas apart from the BD model. So they are doing good as of now. I don't know. We can discuss it later probably.
I just had one thing to say. I'll just leave you with this statistic. This is, I've scanned newspapers over 2023. 1 out of 5 op-eds is written by a woman. And I think it's time. We really, I think as a culture and as men who run important institutions, who run voice producing and knowledge sharing platforms, I think it's time. Many of those men need to have dinner with themselves and ask themselves some tough questions about why are we producing these outcomes. And these are all extremely liberal, progressive men, when you ask them their views, but yet somehow the outcomes are 1 out of 5, and I think it's unacceptable. I'll leave it at that. I think ma'am had a question at the back.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Sandhya Deveshan. I teach at DU. And I'm the convener of the Center for Women's Studies at JMC. I think I have a bone to pick with, looking at the problem of gender simply through a policy framework. And I do kind of appreciate Mathangi's statements on this, because I do think that part of the problem, and the major problem that I've been facing with looking at it simply as a policy question is that we forget that once we have the data, it becomes a question of hermeneutics, and that somebody is required to translate that data for us and to interpret that data. And then we're not asking further questions about the subject position of the person doing the translation. And I think there is a lot of hits and misses, and a lot of I think that the question of justice kind of leaches away when that happens. And also that when we think of outcomes only as a question of economy, then, when we are asking questions of outcomes simply as a matter of an economic outcome, we forget that, woman is also, as again Mathangi I think mentioned, the woman occupies various different kinds of positions, and it's all obviously an intersectional question, but also because I'm coming from an education space, and where are the girls? Where is the question of their education? Where is the question of their political sovereignty? Where is the question of their political justice? Are they able to enter, any of the current debates about, jobs or, their representation in a political arena? And these questions are kind of left by the wayside. And I think at the end of the day, every question becomes a gendered question. The question of water, the question of land, the question of citizenship, the question of, nationality is a gendered question. It comes back to the question of the woman. So I think, is there a way of expanding that vocabulary, expanding that imagination, thinking, and bringing feminist methodology into, conversations that we're having about gender analysis? Is it possible?
Yeah.
Is where I'm at.
Thank you for your
Thank you.
question. If you would like to respond to that very quickly.
I'll simply say policy can be a lever for that. So I don't think we can ever sidestep those questions of who is in roles of decision making and how those decisions are being made. Affirmative action, to me, that's a policy lever as well, right? So I think I'll just leave it at that.
No, thank you for that question. I think it stands central to the ways in which we are trying to make it more complex. And I will say in many ways, while I did sort of produce that idea of woman as a complex subject, I see things like affirmative action, bodies in public space, as very much part of being able to produce that complexity. The very fact that across panels throughout the day today, we have been talking about questions of sisterhood, we have been talking about women helping women, about voices, Secretary Ahuja spoke about it. So you see it coming up, but not in a way that it can gather into a mass yet. At the same time, I do think that in questions of policy, those categories and their slow movement are perhaps producing possibility, as we all clearly share.
I think we also alluded to it when we talked about invisibility in informal work and women's work and care work. So I think many dimensions of women have been highlighted by this panel, and particularly when they work. So I think we've addressed some of those, but we can have a conversation later if you want to.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that brings us to the end of the discussion, and I want to thank all the panelists for sharing their insights and perspectives on some of the social and economic lives of women. And I hope the audience found today's discussion thought-provoking, and I hope it spurs some more reflection. And so yeah, that brings us to the end of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Raghav. Thank you, Raghav.
Just a moment before we request all the panelists to accept this token of appreciation.